You wouldn't believe what the county assessor saw the day he pulled up to that farm, because even he didn't believe it at first. And this is a man whose entire job is to measure land, calculate value, and verify ownership. Yet when he stepped out of his car and looked across the field stretching farther than his eyes could comfortably track, he froze, checked his paperwork, then checked it again, and then a third time, just to be sure he wasn't making a mistake, because the number written there didn't match what his mind was willing to accept. 1,200 acres, all owned by one man, fully paid off, actively worked, and somehow sustained using equipment that should have stopped running decades earlier, machines that looked like they belonged in a scrapyard rather than on productive farmland. And standing there in complete silence, he said something out loud without even realizing it. How did he do this? And that question, that single question, is what brings us back to a dusty road in Mississippi in 1961, where the real story begins. But before we go there, understand this. What you're about to hear is not just a story about farming. It's about resilience, systems designed to limit people, and what happens when someone refuses to accept those limits. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll realize this isn't just about one man. It's about a mindset that changes everything. So let's go back to that moment where it all started. September 1961. A 30-year-old man named Henry Tate drives 12 miles into Greenwood, Mississippi. Not for anything big, not for land, not for a tractor, just for a simple $6 plow point for his Farm All H, the kind of small, ordinary part that any equipment dealer keeps stocked without a second thought. Something so basic it shouldn't even be a story, but what happened next turned it into one. Henry pulls up outside Caldwell's John Deere dealership, the only place in the county that carried the part he needed. Walks up to the door, reaches for the handle, and it doesn't open. Locked, even though inside everything says the business is operating. Lights on, people moving, conversations happening, the owner Roy Caldwell leaning casually against the counter talking to customers, a worker pulling parts from shelves, everything normal except for one thing. The door between Henry and what he came for stays closed, so he knocks, waits. Roy looks at him, makes eye contact, and then deliberately turns away, as if nothing happened. Henry knocks again, harder this time, hoping maybe it was a misunderstanding, but nothing changes. No one moves. One of the men inside glances toward the door, then quickly looks away. And for 10 full minutes, Henry stands there, not saying a word, not causing a scene, just waiting. Until eventually he turns around, walks back to his truck, and drives home without the $6 part he came for. And here's the thing. No one needed to explain what just happened, because Henry already understood it completely. This wasn't about a locked door. It was about a decision made by the people inside, not to open it. And in Mississippi in 1961, that kind of decision wasn't unusual for a black man. But what makes this story powerful is not what happened at that door. It's who was standing outside it. Because Henry Tate was not the man they assumed he was. He was born in 1,931 inches, a small shotgun house on a cotton plantation near Itabena, raised by his father Moses Tate, a sharecropper who spent 30 years working land he would never own, putting in season after season of backbreaking labor, only to end each year with nothing to show for it, because every harvest was balanced against the cost of seed, fertilizer, and equipment, and somehow the numbers always came out the same or worse. A system designed so that no matter how hard you worked, you stayed exactly where you were. And Henry watched this cycle repeat over and over throughout his childhood. Watched his father work from sunrise to exhaustion, watched the ledger books that never seemed to favor him, watched a life where effort didn't equal progress, and one day, when Henry was just 14 years old, his father said something that would stay with him forever. Something simple, but powerful. The only way out is to own the dirt you stand on. And those words became more than advice. They became a mission. Because Moses Tate never escaped that system. He died in 1958, still working the same land he started on decades earlier. Leaving behind no property, no wealth, just that one sentence. And Henry decided that would be enough. So after his father's death, he worked harder than anyone around him, taking a job as a hired hand on a large farm near Greenwood, where his skill quickly became obvious. He could fix machines others gave up on, predict yields just by looking at a field, understand weather patterns without needing forecasts, And even the farm owner admitted privately that Henry knew more than he did. But knowledge didn't change the reality of the time, because, despite his ability, Henry didn't have land, and more importantly, he didn't have access to the system that allowed others to get it. Banks refused to lend to black farmers. Government programs meant to support agriculture routinely excluded them or offered unfair terms. And the entire structure was built to keep people like Henry exactly where they were. But unlike most, Henry didn't wait for that system to change. He saved everything he could, living with almost nothing, keeping every dollar possible. Until in 1961, an opportunity appeared. 80 acres of land no one else wanted. Rough, covered in stumps, heavy clay soil prone to flooding. Not real farmland yet, just potential. Priced at $30 an acre, $2,400 total. Henry went to the bank, got denied. Went to a government office, got denied again. But instead of stopping there, he went directly to the owner, an elderly woman named Adeline Cross, and offered to buy it in cash. And after a long look at him, she agreed. No paperwork delays, no outside approval, just a decision, and in that moment, Henry Tate became a landowner, the first in his family's history. And that's where everything truly began. Because owning land was only the first step. Turning it into something productive would take years of effort. Most people wouldn't even consider. But Henry didn't hesitate. He found an old tractor at an auction, bought basic equipment, repaired everything himself, and when he couldn't get parts from the dealer who refused to serve him, he found other ways. Salvage yards, catalogs, broken machines, turned into spare parts. And then, he started clearing land, one stump at a time, by hand. No shortcuts, no help, just determination and consistency. And this is where most people would have quit. But Henry didn't. Because he wasn't working for quick results, he was building something that couldn't be taken away. And slowly, year by year, acre by acre, that land started to change. And so did everything else around him, even if no one noticed yet. And what most people didn't see at that time, what nobody standing on the outside could fully understand, was that Henry wasn't just clearing land. He was quietly rewriting the rules that had defined his entire life up to that point. Because while others measured progress in seasons or profits, Henry measured it in control. Control over his land, his time, and most importantly, his future. And that shift in thinking is what made everything that followed possible. Because by the end of 1962, after months of backbreaking labor, pulling stumps out of unforgiving ground, digging, chaining, pulling again and again, until the roots finally gave way, he had transformed half of those 80 acres into workable farmland. Not perfect, not easy, but usable. And when he planted his first crops, cotton on one side, soybeans on the other, he wasn't expecting miracles. He was looking for proof. Proof that the land could respond. Proof that his effort wasn't being wasted. And the results came exactly how you'd expect from land that had been ignored for decades. Modest, uneven, but real. The cotton yield wasn't impressive, about half a bale per acre, but it was enough to confirm something important. And the soybeans, surprisingly, performed better, holding moisture in that dense clay soil when other fields in the area struggled. And that was the moment Henry noticed something others had overlooked for years. Because while most farmers had dismissed that land as difficult, Henry saw its advantage. He realized that what made it challenging in one way made it valuable in another, and instead of forcing the land to behave like everything else, he adjusted his strategy to match what the land naturally offered. And that single decision, that ability to observe instead of assume, became one of the most important advantages he would ever have. Because from that point forward, every move he made was based on understanding, not tradition. And while people in the county continued to talk, continued to doubt, continued to predict that he would fail within a couple of years, Henry didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't try to prove anything to anyone. Because he wasn't building for them, he was building for himself. And by 1963, when all 80 acres were finally cleared and fully planted, something had already begun to shift, not just in the land, but in the consistency of his results. And consistency is where real progress starts, because it's easy to get one good season, but it's much harder to repeat it. And Henry focused entirely on that repetition, improving small things each year, rotating crops, learning how the soil reacted, growing vegetables on the side to create additional income, selling surplus at the local market, and slowly building a system where every part supported the other. And this is where his story separates from everyone else around him, because while other farmers expanded quickly using loans, buying newer equipment, increasing acreage beyond what they could comfortably manage, Henry did the opposite. He stayed small, stayed disciplined, and most importantly, stayed debt-free. And at the time, that didn't look impressive. In fact, it looked like he was falling behind, because in the 1960s and 70s, growth was the standard. Bigger farms, bigger machines, bigger risks, all supported by borrowed money. And for a while, that system worked. It made people look successful. It made operations appear strong. But underneath it all, it created something fragile. Something that depended entirely on everything continuing to go right. And Henry saw that. Maybe not in the same financial language others used, but in a way that made more sense to him. He understood that if you don't owe anything, you don't have to worry about losing anything, and that idea guided every decision he made. So while others expanded to hundreds of acres with loans attached to every piece of equipment, Henry stayed on his 80 acres and built something far more stable. And year after year, he saved, every extra dollar set aside, no unnecessary spending, no upgrades unless absolutely needed, repairing instead of replacing, maintaining instead of upgrading, and what looked like slow progress on the outside was actually something much more powerful building underneath, because by the late 1960s, his soybean yields were outperforming many farms in the county. Not because he had better equipment, not because he had more resources, but because he had taken the time to understand exactly what his land needed. And by 1970, that discipline had turned into something measurable. $14,000 saved, not borrowed, not leveraged, saved. And 5 years later, that number doubled, then grew again. And by 1980, he had over $40,000 set aside, all while still farming the same original 80 acres. And that's the part that most people miss when they look at success stories like this. They assume growth comes from expansion, but in Henry's case, it came from control. Because every dollar he saved represented freedom. Freedom to make decisions without pressure. Freedom to wait for the right opportunity instead of taking whatever was available. And that patience would soon become the most valuable asset he had, because while Henry was building quietly, something much larger was happening around him, something that would completely change the agricultural landscape across the country, and especially in places like Mississippi. The system that had rewarded rapid expansion and heavy borrowing began to collapse under its own weight. Interest rates rose, commodity prices dropped, and suddenly, all those loans that once seemed manageable became impossible to sustain. And farms that had been in families for generations started to disappear, auctioned off, foreclosed, sold under pressure. And for many, it felt like everything they had built was being taken away. But for Henry, this moment, this crisis that devastated so many others, became the opportunity he had been unknowingly preparing for his entire life. Because while others were trapped by debt, Henry had none. While others were forced to sell, Henry was in a position to buy, and he didn't rush, didn't overextend. He waited, watched, and when the right deals appeared, he acted. The first purchase, 120 acres next to his land, priced low because the bank needed to recover losses quickly, Henry paid cash, no negotiation stress, no approval needed, just a simple transaction. And then another opportunity came. And another. Each time the same approach. Disciplined, calculated, never exceeding what he could afford. And within just a few years, the man who had once been dismissed as someone who wouldn't last had expanded his operation far beyond what anyone had expected. And by the late 1980s, Henry Tate owned 440 acres of land, all paid for, all under his control. And what makes this moment so powerful is not just the number, it's the contrast. Because many of the same people who had access to loans, support, and opportunities had lost everything, while the man who had been denied those same opportunities had built something stronger without them. And it wasn't luck, it wasn't timing alone, it was the result of decades of consistent decisions, small choices repeated over and over again. And this is where the story starts to shift from survival to something bigger. Because once Henry reached that level, once he secured his own position, he didn't stop. He didn't just sit back and maintain what he had built. He continued forward, not just for himself, but in a way that would eventually impact others as well. And that's where the next chapter begins. Because what he did after building his own success is what truly sets his story apart from everything that came before it.